You are currently in the defense track, and we are here to listen to intrusion detection along the kill chain, presented by four.
Hello, test, one. Can you guys hear me all right? All right. Thanks for coming. Welcome. It's really good to be here, and I appreciate you guys crowding in for me. We're going to have fun today. This is going to be something I think you'll enjoy, I hope. If any of you guys do defense and try to prevent people from breaking into organizations' detect when they do, that's what we're here to talk about. So hopefully you'll enjoy our time together. I think you will. So let's get started. So, who am I? This is probably the least interesting part, but my name is For. I work at Facebook with a really awesome team of very, very smart people that care a lot about our users' data. And I do intrusion detection stuff, and I've been doing intrusion detection stuff for quite a while, for a lot longer than I probably look. In fact, it's possible that I've spent the majority of my adult life, my conscious adult life, thinking about intrusion detection, and that's not actually joking. So this talk's a little bit different. I know you guys have been going to a bunch of talks here at Blackhat. I really appreciate you guys coming to mine. We're going to do things a little different here. You know, when I think back about what I like best about Blackhat talks, you know, there's a lot of really good talks about some O-days and some really great technical talks. And, you know, we're definitely going to cover a lot of technical content. But when I think back about what I really take away most from those things is I come up with a bunch of ideas, and I get really excited about stuff, right? And so this talk is actually designed with that in mind, to try to get, you know, I'm going to present some technical ideas, but I also want to get you guys excited, and I want to get you guys thinking about this problem and working with me on this problem. And so, as such, you know, if you come away with none of the technical content in your mind, but excited and some new ideas of your own, then I will consider this mission accomplished. So if you come away, with just one idea, I think that would be worthwhile. Okay, so this is a story in 3 acts, kind of like a Shakespearean tragedy, not too different, in fact. Where Act 1, we're going to talk a little bit about where intrusion detection stands today, right? How many of you guys have worked on intrusion detection or related technologies, right? Like the majority of you, okay? Thank you for that. So this is clearly something of interest. So let's talk a little bit about where we're at. Now, the security industry is estimated roughly, these things are hard to estimate, but roughly at about a $35 billion a year industry. $35 billion a year. The amount of money spent on intrusion detection is likewise quite high, but also a little bit hard to pin down. So according to IDC, which is a research company, they say that the SIEM market alone is a $1.5 billion a year industry, just the SIEM market alone. And so I think it's pretty clear, even if it's hard to pin down the exact numbers, that intrusion detection is something we're spending a fair bit of money on. And so the natural question for all of us to ask ourselves is, how well are these systems working for us? All right, we got the shiny red box, you know, on the rack. It's like it's got not just one Ethernet, but 3 connected to it. So it's got to do something awesome, right? So let's talk a little bit about how well these systems work. So there's a couple of companies that do a really good thing for all of us. And these companies actually produce these things that are these kind of reports, these analytical reports about the state of the industry. Now, the most venerable of these is Verizon's data breach report. And this has been out for several years now. How many of you guys have heard of this report, the Verizon data breach? Oh, okay, cool. So like most everybody. Awesome. How many of you guys have actually read the report from cover to cover? Okay, cool. So the most recent Verizon report is awesome. It's got more data than ever. It covers 855 cases. It has data from not just Verizon's incident response work, which in and of itself, by the way, covers a pretty broad swath of incidents, right? But it also includes a bunch of law enforcement data. And over the years, they've actually added to that increasingly. So they've got now not just Secret Service, but they've got some foreign law enforcement agencies involved. So it's this pretty decent report that covers a lot of the bases as far as intrusions go. Now let's take a look at what they have to say about intrusion detection's efficacy. So we'll start a little slow, but just kind of go through the data. So the first thing that I noticed when I was reading the report was that 7 out of 10 targeted attacks happen against larger organizations. This is probably not super surprising, right? Targeted attacks clearly are going to go after these larger orgs. Larger orgs, by the way, Verizon defines as over 1,000 employees. So, okay, that's maybe not super exciting. But the interesting thing about that is you would expect that these larger orgs would be more likely to have invested in intrusion detection systems of some kind, right? So now the data is starting to look a little bit more interesting. Half of these intrusions that these various groups looked at took months or years for them to discover. Now, I think discovery time is one proxy, maybe not the best proxy, but one proxy for the efficacy of intrusion detection systems. Months or years to discover an intrusion, right? That's kind of a long time, don't you think? Okay. What else do we have to say? Well, it took months or years to discover the intrusion, but in fact, the attackers compromised us in minutes or less, according to the report, at least 71% of the time. Okay, that's not good. This one's kind of a positive note, right? So 75% of the time, it took days or longer to exfiltrate data in larger organizations. So this is kind of cool. This is one sort of beam of light in an otherwise dark place, right? Which is that once they compromise you, they do it pretty quickly, but then they have to rifle around in your drawers in order to figure out what they're actually getting at, what they're looking for, what accounts they want to escalate to, and what data they're actually after, right? So I'll just put this kind of as a footnote, right? But this is kind of cool. So we have days or longer of them doing all kinds of stuff in order to detect them. So when we get to the other acts of the play, we're gonna see how we might be able to take that and use that to our advantage. Okay, let's keep talking about Verizon just a little bit more. So the first thing of note is that how do these things get discovered? How do you find out about an intrusion? So this is getting to the heart of the matter, right? The very meat of the story. These intrusions get discovered most of the time by somebody else telling you at most companies, right? Half of them. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad for a larger org. I mean, half of them discovered by a third party. Well, that means, right, the other half detected by our intrusion detection appliance, right? No, actually, not so much. So a third of these detections are detected by your users saying this, right? Hey, something's weird, right? Something is up. A sysadmin noticing that there's a weird process running on their server that's not normal, or a user that has a mouse cursor. You guys ever seen this where there's a user and there's a mouse cursor moving around and they're like, oh, I'm under attack. So turns out some of the time that's actually real. I actually had a real case once where somebody had a wireless mouse and they were right next to an elevator shaft, and every time the elevator went up and down, their mouse cursor would move, and they thought it was an attacker. Anyway, okay, so all right, so the story is starting to sound maybe not quite so rosy, right? Purpose-built fraud detection systems classified by Verizon, which is a proxy for intrusion detection systems, detected 5%. 5% of the attacks that this caseload looked at. 5%. Now, how do you contrast that? How do we compare that? Well, routine log review discovered 8% of intrusions. So my shiny intrusion detection system against these targeted threats, or against all threats really, Verizon covers all threats, is worse than a bunch of people sitting in a room looking at logs. Right? If like I take random samplings of you and have you look at my logs, that's better, according to the data, than an intrusion detection system? I mean, that's pretty bad. So what do we have here? We have we have a case where routine log review is better than intrusion detection systems, and that we have a 6x, 6 times worse than a user noticing something is weird is how good our intrusion detection system is. All right, you might say, well, that's just one report. That's got to be crazy, right? What I say is, Houston, we have a problem. Okay, so hold on. All right, just one report, no big deal, right? Let's see what else we got. Let's look at some other data. Maybe this is off. Okay, well, there's another report out there. I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of reports. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them. But another one that I like is one by a company called Mandiant. They don't just throw parties where you get drunk at the Shadow Bar. Turns out they actually do reports too. I love Mandiant. They're awesome. But they have an annual report as well. And in their most recent report, so just a little background on Mandiant. You guys probably mostly know a little bit about Mandiant, but just so you know, their report and their work is a little bit more narrow than Verizon's report covers, because it's actually more focused on the so-called APT, the so-called targeted attacks, right? And so the data is a little bit more skewed. Like Verizon's is a little bit more general, whereas Mandiant's data is a little bit more specialized. Okay, how well do you think our intrusion detection systems do in Mandiant's report? Well, 6% of advanced intrusions were detected by an internal process. 6%. And guess what? An internal process is not, as we learned in the last couple slides, an intrusion detection system, right? It could be manual log review. It could be your users noticing something's weird, right? 6%. And in reality, I would surmise that, in fact, a small fraction of that is actually what was detected by an intrusion detection system. So now we have 2 corroborating data sources. And to that, I say, Houston, we really have a problem. So, all right. Some people, sort of like climate change, may say, hey, you're making up numbers, or these numbers are wrong, right? But the number of you that raised your hands makes me believe that you guys agree with me, that you know what I'm talking about, that you know that these numbers aren't just fabricated numbers, that this actually aligns with our intuition. In our experience, to the extent that you have that experience, against especially advanced attacks, our intrusion detection systems are not working. They're pathetic. It's sad. And as somebody like me, who cares very deeply about intrusion detection, it's alarming, in fact, to have reached this place in the history of computer security. So alarming, in fact, that I actually quit the field of information security altogether for a brief amount of time because I was so distraught. So that's part 1, the state of where we are with intrusion detection. Now, what can we do? Well, let's start with first principles. Let's start with what intrusion detection is all about. What are we trying to accomplish with intrusion detection? Well, like all good first principles, let's start with a definition. This is my definition. I'm sure yours is probably different, but this one has served me well. The art and science of finding actionable deviations between normal behavior and attacker behavior. Fundamentally, when you think about it down to the core, what you're doing in intrusion detection is you're separating the attacker from the user. It's like a centrifuge, right? Perhaps this definition rings more true now that we're in Vegas, but this is perhaps a more concise way to digest this, right? And this definition is going to carry us forward into one of my first principles that I think you need to really internalize. And that's this. Intrusion detection events are not binary affairs. This is the single biggest mistake that pretty much everybody makes. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You plug in an intrusion detection system, and you go through a process of tuning, right? Let's say a NIDS, a snort box or something like that. You go through a process of tuning. What does tuning involve? Well, you turn it on, it creates a bunch of alerts, and you turn them all off until it doesn't make any noise anymore. Right? You're laughing, but it's true, right? This is what people do. I'm not actually making this up, right? So they turn every single thing off, and then there's no alerts, and then they say, okay, peace. Everything that happens after this is going to be the attacker, right? Well, this is what I call the false positive fallacy. The notion that things that create spurious events are of no use, are of no value. The reality is that these noisy events that sometimes indicate false positive things and sometimes indicate attacker behavior are in fact the most important thing in our arsenal. And these are heavily underutilized. It's sad. What most people want is an event that can email them to some mailing list and page them or whatever, wake them up in the middle of the night. You're owned, right? That's what everybody wants. And so everybody diligently goes and creates a bunch of events, and they create a bunch of noise, and then they turn them off. Or once in a blue moon they alert, and then everybody freaks out. So everybody is after this mythical event that will wake you up in the middle of the night and tell you you're owned. The reality is much more subtle. Maybe there was one time in history, in computer science, in computer information security, where you could do that, where you could create an event that would email you on some mailing list and would tell you you're owned. Maybe. But that day is not now. That doesn't work against modern attackers. We need a more subtle approach. We need a way to assimilate these noisy signals into our enterprise, into our infrastructure. And I'm going to tell you how to do this. So the first thing I want you to take away from this talk is the notion that all events are welcome, that there is no such thing as a noisy event, right? And so what I'm going to do right now is go through a process where, imagine you have this landscape of events, a landscape of things that can tell you that somebody's compromising you, that there's something suspicious going on. And imagine if you have that landscape and that you want to rank those things from let's say 1 to 10, okay? So that 1 means you're owned, and 10 means nothing. And in between, from between 9 and 2, are things that have something to tell you about something suspicious going on, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through a list of what I came up with. These are some random examples. You will have your own of things that I think are representative of those levels on the noise graph, on the noise number. So number 1 being the most actionable is this. And this is another concept that I think you've heard before. Right? This idea of intelligence-driven detection. Does that sound familiar? Intelligence-driven detection? Well, that's basically the concept that the better your intelligence, the more actionable your events are. So let's say, for example, you happen to know some really good friends that work at some 3-letter agency or something. I'm making this up, by the way. And they, pass you some stuff about some attacker you're worried about, some DNS names that they're using as part of their command and control infrastructure, right? Some, registry keys or something that they've seen them do in the attack. Now, if these are really rare and really narrow to that specific attack, these things can actually be quite good if they're fresh, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Sounds familiar? So I put this as number 1, but this is based on how good your intelligence is, right? There's plenty of open source lists of DNS names that are actually not very good at all. And so I put this as an example of one. If you have a high quality DNS name, then this may be the wake you up in the middle of the night thing. It may be. Okay. A malicious PDF was sent to a user. How would you determine that? Well, there's various ways, tools, vendor products, and so on for analyzing PDFs. And so let's say imagine you live in a certain land where you have these systems in place that can analyze these things, and you happen to see that it's a malicious PDF. So maybe this is something that's part of a phishing attack. Now here's the point that I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to get you to walk away with these examples. I'm trying to get you to understand that there's different levels of events that all have a place in the intrusion detection story. That's what I want you to take away. Okay? So maybe you have logins for a user from disparate geolocations in a short amount of time. Okay? Maybe that's weird, right? Maybe they logged in from here and then, a country thousands of miles away within 10 minutes. Okay? Now, those of you that have done stuff like that know that there are some false positives there. So it's not quite a one. It's not quite a wake you up in the middle of the night event, right? But it is interesting. Okay? So again, intelligence-based detection. NetFlow alerts based on known bad IP addresses that you get fed from somebody that you trust that has a good quality set of data. NetFlow and network-based data is inherently, in my opinion, more noisy. Okay, so I'm going to go through these quickly. Registry modifications. So I'll make this example a few times in the talk, but you guys familiar with the run and run once keys, right? So that's like, probably not even done anymore, but that was like a way that a lot of malware was, maintaining persistence through reboots, back in 2010. So antivirus alerts, as you know, like antivirus has kind of slipped down the list a little bit over the years, but it still has its place. So this is a good one. Snort event for a blank user agent, right? So, maybe somebody that has a blank user agent is indication of a C2. Again, this is kind of a 2010, 2011 example, but hey, what can you do? But my point is, like, maybe that's a number 7. So do I want to have every time I see a blank user agent on my network, do I want to have somebody email me and wake me up in the middle of the night? Of course not, right? Of course not. But is that something that's interesting? Is that something I can use in my intrusion program? Absolutely. All right, so successful logins for Windows RDP. Imagine a snort event that alerted any time it saw any kind of encrypted traffic. Okay, clearly not something you want to send an email to you every time it happens, but still has a place in the intrusion story. And then, of course, at the very bottom is this notion of raw logs. Okay? Okay, you guys still with me? I know that was a little tedious. I'm trying to move quickly. Okay. All right, so you say, okay, well, that's great for. What do you do with all these noisy events? Well, guess what? You put them through the event pipeline. That's this thing that takes these noisy events, right, and turns them into something that's useful. And we're going to talk through this in a little bit of detail. You take your noisy event, then it goes into a blacklisting stage, identity translation, correlation, context gets applied, and then it gets analyzed by a human being. So this is the process, this is the pipeline for how your events, these noisy events that I mentioned, can be part of your intrusion detection story, right? So the big thing I'm trying to tell you is you should instrument the crap out of your environment. You should go through and not be afraid to turn on the fire hose of things for like certain registry actions or all kinds of noisy stuff happening in your network, right? We need to find a way to be able to take all that data and find something interesting out of it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about blacklisting. So the noisy little event, the HTTP with no user agent, right? It was a 7 out of 10, remember? So the blacklisting stage is a process whereby we take those events and we want to push them as far up that stack as we can, as far towards number 1 as we can, right? With the recognition that it's not going to get all the way there. That's okay, right? That's okay. We'll take our 7 and we'll be okay with a 4. If we can get it up to a 4, we're good, right? That's still progress. And so what this is taking out the most egregious false positives from the list and being able to take those signals and drop those on the floor. All right. Has anybody actually turned on a snort event for a blank user agent before? Nobody willing to raise their hand? So I have. And so as soon as I did it, I was like, this was, again, a few years back, so this was actually kind of a cool thing to do then. But I turned it on, and what I found was I was like excited, and I was like ready to chase it down and sound the alarm. And what I found was that the things that were triggering it was actually Fitbit. So you know those dumb things that you put on your pocket and tells you how many steps you take? So, so these things actually call back to their service. And for whatever reason, they just decided not to have RFC compliance. And so they left out the user agent field. I mean, there's a user agent field. It's just blank. So anyway, so the point is, you would take all those cases out. So you would have a system where you get these signals in there, and then you say, okay, here's what I found. I found, Fitbit. All right, we know those are, false positive. Okay, blah blah blah. There's these 5 things right off the cuff. I just took away a giant swath of events, and this sounds maybe lame to you. I don't know, but actually this works really really well, right? And if you have a system whereby you can go back and amend this blacklisting for every single event type, whenever you feel like it, you'll find that it actually cuts down a shocking number of false positives just by itself. Now remember, we still have these events enabled. So this is different than the snort example where you just turned on the sensor, right? Remember? And it turned off all the things that alerted. It's different than that, right? We're suppressing the things that we know are false positives. And what we're doing is we're pushing that signal up that stack. Now the next stage is identity translation. And when you think of identity translation, of course, you think of face-off. And this is the most common picture that I always think of when I think of face-off. I don't know about you guys, but man, there's some crazy stuff on Google image search. Maybe this album's awesome. I don't know. I don't know. But okay, so we got all these signals. We've got them past the blacklisting phase, right? And now we're going to do identity translation. So we're going to take these signals, these events, these signs of suspicious activity, and we're going to try to figure out how to apply a label to them. So this is actually one of the coolest, most important pieces to the puzzle. So think about the HTTP user agent again. This is a problem I know you guys have tried to struggle with before. You get an event on a network sensor, and you only have an IP address, right? You get an event on a host-based thing, and you only have a NetBIOS name, right? You get an event on a log, and you only have a username. Does this sound familiar, right? Well, the solution to that is identity translation. What you want to do is you get an event that has an identity attribute, right? That comes along for the ride. So let's say you have a network event. It has a source IP, right? And that maps to something in your environment, a machine, right? A host. Now, if you have a reasonable handle on your machine inventory at your enterprise, what you can do is actually have a system that allows you to attach labels to this event. So you have this initial event, you've gotten all the noise taken away, and now you can say, all right, I know the source IP, I know the machine, I know what user was on that machine at that time, right? That's not that hard. And so you apply that username to that event as well. Additionally, you can apply all the users that were on that machine if it's a multi-user host. You can apply all the identity things that you can come up with. MAC address, you can apply various types of usernames if you have different usernames in your environment or something like that. So the point is that after an event exits this stage, it's going to have every single possible identity that you can think of on there that may apply to that event. This is super important as we go into the correlation stage, right? Because you're going to want to be able to compare apples to apples. You're going to want to say, okay, I have a network event over here, I have a host-based event over here, right? But you want to be able to look at them through the same lens. We'll talk about that more in a minute, right? But it's super, super important to try to have some system that can apply these tags to these events. Does this make sense? Are you guys with me? Hello? Okay. I think you're lost in this picture of Bow Wow. Okay, so where are we? We're winding our little way through the picture. We've gotten the false positives out of the way. We've gotten all these events now that have been pushed up the stack. Maybe we have a bunch of 5 events, a bunch of 2 events, a bunch of 4 events, and all these things are tagged with all the identities that we can come up with, right? The usernames, the whatever. Now, what do you do with that? What do you do with that shit? How do you turn it into something useful? Well, I'm going to offer you some ideas. So this is classically known as correlation in the industry, although I try to shy away from using these sort of industry terms because they're kind of loaded. Because everybody thinks of correlation and they're like, well, that doesn't really work. Well, that's because you're doing it wrong. So, okay, so what is correlation trying to do? So it's trying to take all these so we went around, we instrumented everything we could in our environment, right? We came up with every single noisy, crappy thing we could come up with, and we sort of attached a meter to it. We created these events, right? So correlation is the process of taking these low events and sticking them together and then trying to surface higher quality events, okay? Make sense? So how do we do that? I'm going to introduce this concept of the attack plane. Hopefully it doesn't look like this. This is the idea of having a lens. When I say plane, by the way, I mean like a geometric plane, not like this thing. What I mean is basically like a dimensional space by which you can stack these events on. Then you can attach these events to. Right? The plane is sort of the surface upon which you take all these noisy events and put them together, sort of like Legos. Right? So let's look at kind of a simple example, if you will, a kind of a trivial example of an attack plane. So this example is, the attack plane is simply a host. Right? This is actually a fairly classic type of correlation. This is host-based correlation. So this is the idea of taking all these noisy events, right, and stacking them on a host lens, right, a host plane. So a host is what? An IP address in this case. And so you take every event that happens to have an IP address assigned to it, or attached to it, right, and you put them together. And so what does this tell you? This tells you that this machine happened to have not just one thing that was going on that was suspicious, but actually 4 things in this example, right? IP address 1.2.3.4. And if we look at the next page here, this is a way, you can see you could group, 1.2.3.4's events together. You group 4.3.2.1's events together. Okay, this is not intended to be rocket science. This is actually very classic vanilla correlation. But it's my example, my illustration of what an attack plane is. It's a lens upon which to put your events. Does that make sense to people? Are you guys still with me? Yeah? Okay. Right? Not, like I said, rocket science. Now, let's see if we can come up with some more advanced types of attack planes. Right? And I bet we can. So, I'll have to introduce a couple of concepts before we get there. One of them is known as the kill chain. So I predict this is going to be one of the hottest trends in computer security, or at least intrusion detection, this notion of the kill chain. This is a cool concept. So this is something started by the US military, I believe, or at least a military. I think it was US military. And it was basically this concept of there's these various stages to an attack. And I think the key point is that there's a set of stages that are necessary for any given attack to be successful. So the military example, and if there's military people in the room, like I'm not a military person, so forgive my poor analogies, but in a military context, the way it works is, the soldier has the eyes on the target, they radio to HQ, the HQ has to confirm, that they can pull the trigger, and then the trigger can be pulled, right? And the point is that there's a series of stages that are necessarily the case. And so the US military has actually done some work on 2 sides of this. One, how to accelerate the chain. So in other words, how to make this whole process faster so that you can kill people more efficiently, right? And then the other side of the fence is they say, we recognize that our attackers are actually going to be going through this process, that they're going to necessarily have these stages in their attack. And as such, perhaps there's a way we can disrupt them at various stages in the attack once we understand that they necessarily have to go through these stages. Now, some really smart guys took this concept from the US military, the guys were at Lockheed, and it's Hutchins, Cloppert, and Amin. If you guys are here, talk to you guys after. But they took that and brought it into the information security domain, right? So the idea is that an information security attacker has to go through a series of stages in order to attack a target. And the cool thing about this is that this is much more stable than the given 0 days that you'll hear about Blackhat, right? You'll hear about a bunch of 0 days, and those are real, and those are great talks. But the point of this is that the kill chain, the stages an attacker has to go through, are actually more stable. And so if there's a way we can use that in our intrusion detection lifecycle, that we may have a chance of detecting these things. So let's go through, this is my paraphrased version of the Cloppert, Amin, and Hutchins paper. I've changed this fairly significantly, actually, from their version. The reason I did this is because I wanted to try to expand upon the stages that are involved in the internal part of your organization, right? I wanted to kind of zoom in, if you will, on the parts where they're they're actually attacking you, right? To try to illustrate the chances we might have for doing intrusion detection. Okay, so I'll go through the stages real quick. You can come up with your own stages, like whatever, right? It doesn't really matter. But, okay, so recon is the initial stage where the attacker is setting up their infrastructure, right? They're doing some passive reconnaissance against your organization. They're setting up their command and control infrastructure, right? Sound familiar? Right, then there's attack delivery. How does attack deliveries happen most often today? Anybody know? Yeah, email. Email is the transport mechanism. You've got your PDFs, you've got your drive-by downloads, right? Those are probably the most common. There's others, of course. Once that delivery is accomplished, the exploitation happens of the host, right? That PDF compromises that machine, gets some code execution on there. After that, there's a command and control part where that machine might download additional software for its beaconing and whatnot, and try to make some HTTP requests or something like that. This is all pretty vanilla stuff. After that, at some point in the future, the targeted attacker will take advantage of this compromised machine and sort of become more active, issue it specific commands, right? So one of those commands might be to dump your password hashes, right? This is pretty common. Internal recon. So once they've gotten your machine compromised, they're actually doing interactive command line stuff on that machine. They'll start looking around for, and this is the part, remember I said 71% of attacks or whatever it was takes days or longer, right? This is the part where they're doing internal recon. They're looking at your documents. They're looking at your wikis or whatever you have internally and trying to figure out who's got the passwords to the place that they want to get and how do your systems work. After they figured that out, they do this lateral movement. And this isn't a strictly linear graph, it's important to note. There may be circular kind of things, like they do some lateral movement and they do some more reconnaissance, right? So, but the point is that these are general stages, I think. So then they become different users and so on. Then they establish persistence, usually some point along the chain, maybe not at this point, maybe a little earlier. And then they stage the data that they're looking for, assuming that they're actually taking data out, and they exfiltrate the data. Does this sound familiar? Right? Does this ring a bell? Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is, right, like if you're going around and you're trying to like detect some 0-day on your network, I mean, that's cool. But like the reality is that your attackers are actually going through this strict series of patterns. And so perhaps there's a way we can leverage this in order to do intrusion detection. What do you guys think? Maybe? Okay, so let's see. So you guys cool with the kill chain? Yeah? All right. So remember our concept of attack planes just a minute ago, where we were grouping things by IP address? Yeah? So let's go back to that for a minute, right? And let's group things by a different notion. Let's group things by the kill chain. Let's use a kill chain as our attack plane. Okay? So what we have here are 3 different events. The color coding is kind of supposed to represent how noisy they are, right? The point is that any one of these events by itself would never be enough to wake you up in the middle of the night. Okay? So this is just a new way of doing correlation. So we've got all these events, they've come in. One is the command and control. So let's just take for a stupid example, the command and control is our blank user agent. That's the way we've detected command and control is happening. So when you detect that, at the instrumentation time, you've applied the notion that it's a command and control part of the chain to the event. So the event has the fact that it's possibly part of a C2. It's got a certain value for how noisy it is. It's got all these different attributes of what identity it's got, right? So you've got an IP address that comes off your network sensor, but you've done the identity translation, and so you've been able to figure out that it's UID Bob that was actually on that machine at that time. Probably it has a bunch of identities, but that's one of them. And so the one common denominator of all these events, I like common denominators as user IDs. You can choose whatever you like. But when you do your identity translation, if you choose a common denominator of Bob, then that allows you to of user ID. Then that allows you to see these events kind of together. Okay, so we've got the internal reconnaissance is what IR stands for. So that's them rifling through your documents, internal documents. So maybe you have a system that detects an egregious number of accesses to internal documents. Maybe that'd be something useful. Again, egregious accesses to internal documents is not something you want to be woken up in the night for, right? So it's kind of a lower confidence thing. Okay, and then the other example is exploitation. That's what E is for. And that, my trivial example of that is the registry run key change, right? I mean, these are dumb examples. You can come up with much more sophisticated examples, probably from listening to other talks here. So then you would group all these together, and you would create a correlated event. And so the point is that you can actually use the kill chain, which is far more stable, to kind of come up with a better correlation model. And in fact, you guys are probably got a million ideas on this subject too. Can you guys come up with, another way of thinking about these noisy events in context, another way of correlating these events? Probably. And I think the most powerful intrusion detection system will be one that actually uses multiple correlation models to group these events. Okay, so recall, we're kind of winding our way through our event pipeline. We've decided that we love these noisy events that we previously, 40 minutes ago, you hated, right? You've reduced the noise of these events by doing blacklisting, and then you've started to do some correlation, right? Maybe you just do simple IP-based correlation. Maybe you do the kill chain model. Maybe you have 4 or 5 other ways of doing correlation on your own. So the next stage in the pipeline is called context, or out of context. Anybody know what this is from? Yeah, nice. Yeah, I don't remember this episode myself, but it looks whimsical. Okay, so here we are, context. So at the context stage, presumably, we've done correlation, and we've pushed our events up. So we've done the blacklisting, we've pushed our events up the stack, we've put those events that are pushed up the stack together, and then we've popped them out the other side, right? And now we have these events that hopefully somebody wants to look at, right? So what do we do with those events? Do we just show them at somebody? Well, I think we can do better than that, right? And this is where the concept of situational awareness comes in. You guys ever heard of that? Another military concept, actually, right? Turns out they've been thinking about this stuff a little longer than we have. So the idea of context is that there's a bunch of stuff in your environment that's actually useful, that most people that do intrusion detection aren't using. And I think this is a big mistake. You see, your systems that do intrusion detection aren't just for pumping out events. They can actually be used to add context to events that something else created. This is actually a really powerful concept. So let's say you've done your correlation, you found a possible kill chain, right? And you have these 3 events, right? One's a network event, one's a host event, and so on, right? And you want to shove that into some analyst's face and say, hey, check this out, like this looks crazy. And so if you could pre-populate that event with a bunch of information about stuff in your environment, that might be kind of cool. So one example is maybe there's some relevant logs. Maybe you could actually get the list of processes running on the machine itself at the time of the supposed compromise, right? There's a bunch of this data that actually exists in your organization that nobody really knows how to include in the intrusion detection story. But it turns out it's actually super valuable when you're applying context, when you're actually analyzing the event. And the goal here, by the way, is to reduce the amount of time that someone has to screw around looking at these events, right? So that they can look at more in a day. And so these various systems, like a network forensic system, for example, may be able to bring to bear some network data on that event that actually never alerted on it in the first place. Right? Think about your company where you work. Think about all the different stuff you've bought, and you probably have a bunch, right? And think about the fact that most people are probably just having those things send them emails or send them alerts, right? But you can actually use the APIs of those systems to get at more data to surface when it's time to look at an event. So I think that's another important point, this idea of context. Okay, so I want to talk a few final thoughts here. So one of the things that's interesting is, I think they dropped this slogan some time ago, but Blackhat's slogan used to be digital self-defense. Does that sound familiar? I don't know even know if they have a slogan anymore. But I go to Blackhat, I love Blackhat, I go to all these talks, right? And they're all about breaking shit, right? And I mean, Blackhat, it's an offensive conference, I get it, right? But I talked to the organizers when I submitted my talk, and they told me that nobody actually submits defense talks. Like, and maybe that's why I'm here today, and the only reason, right? But nobody actually submits defense talks, like, except for vendors. Vendors do, of course, but that's got its own issues. But like, given how dire the situation is in intrusion detection, like, why the hell aren't people like you working on this? Why the hell aren't smart people like yourself helping with this problem, right? Like, and maybe you are, and maybe those people that are just doing this stuff are like doing it in a silo, and there's some people doing some awesome shit in the silos. I happen to know that some people are. But I want to talk to you, because just like there's been kind of a thawing in recent years of talking about data breaches, I'd like to see a little more thawing of talking about intrusion detection, because we're so fucked, right? And like, I mean, there's some people that are doing really good work. I know some of you are, right? But in general, as a society, we're pretty well fucked against attackers, against modern attackers. And like, this is really kind of like unacceptable, right? Like, these people are off like owning like ring -1, like rings I've never even heard of, right? And like, in the meantime, like, what are we doing, right? What are we doing? So, anyway, if you are passionate about this subject, and I sincerely hope you are, I would really love to talk to you. And so here's my contact info. And if anybody's doing anything remotely interesting in intrusion detection, like, please get in touch with me, because I want to collaborate with you. I'm passionate about this subject. I think we can do a lot better as a society, and I'd love to work with you to do it. Anyway, thank you.